Today we will talk about the biggest tragedy in Soviet hiking tourism, the so-called tragedy of the 30th route. This story is truly extraordinary, not only because of the number of victims, but also due to the sheer irresponsibility, fatal mistakes, and simple human cruelty involved. But let's go step by step. The year is 1975, the golden age of tourism in the Soviet Union. Borders are closed, but people crave adventure. They want to travel. That's why young people, students, set off into the forests, the mountains, and on water hikes. Tourism is at its peak of popularity. What was initially a wild and dangerous pursuit is gradually becoming more civilized. Official routes start appearing, marked trails where guides lead tourists. Tourism, which was once a sacred activity reserved for rugged geologists, taiga dwellers, and polar explorers, is becoming accessible to everyone. Not only highly skilled, experienced hikers go on these trips, but also ordinary people, many of whom have no connection to tourism at all. It becomes wildly popular among the youth, especially students, practically a nationwide craze. Now let's get to the point. The 30th All-Union Route, also known as Through the Mountains to the Sea. It starts in the village of Kadzak and ends in Dagomis. The route is considered easy, even outright simple. Even children's groups have taken it. It was, and still is, a well-traveled path. Many groups move along it in different directions. There are well-trodden trails, designated campsites, and plenty of tourist bases, all the conditions for a comfortable outdoor experience. Among professional hikers, this route wasn't popular because it was too easy and crowded. It was considered unprestigious. But no matter how simple it seems, the route still goes through the mountains, and mountains must always be respected. Now let's talk about the group. They were assigned the number 93. The group consisted of 53 people. For those unfamiliar with group tourism, that is an extremely large number. Even by Soviet standards, this was a very large group, requiring strong organization and highly qualified guides. But we'll get to that later. The group was diverse, people from different corners of the Soviet Union, Central Asia, Ukraine, and Central Russia. Vouchers for this trip were even distributed at workplaces. People went there to relax, eat food cooked over a campfire, drink by the fire to the sound of a guitar, and simply have a good time. Most of them were far from being experienced tourists. They were not professional hikers. In fact, the majority had no hiking experience at all. However, everything started quite reasonably. The group was accommodated at a tourist base for 5 whole days under the guidance of an experienced guide, Alexei Ajiv. Together with him, they went on small training hikes in the surrounding area, preparing for the upcoming major trek. But according to eyewitnesses, in addition to training and exploring the area, they also drank a lot. As I mentioned, most people came there for the social aspect. They were having a great time. I assume that over those 5 days, certain groups with shared interests formed. After all, it's clear that 53 people couldn't all interact with each other at the same time. So it's likely that during these 5 days, they naturally split into smaller interest-based groups. And then the series of fatal mistakes began. Alexei Agiv left. He had to return to his main job. Hiking was just a hobby for him. He worked as a school teacher and had to go back to school as the academic year was starting. He left the group in the hands of 2 assistants, Alexei Safonov and Olga Kovaleva. They were just simple students from the Donetsk Agricultural Institute. These guys did have some hiking experience, but it was minimal, and they had no experience leading groups at all. Moreover, they had only walked this particular route once before. On top of that, they were students, while many participants in the group were older than them. So, they had little to no authority over the group. But there weren't enough guides, so they had to use whoever was available. And so, on the morning of September 9th, after receiving their food supplies, the tourists set out on their route. Splitting the 50 people into 2 groups, Alexei and Olga decided to take a new route option that had been proposed that same year. Guzeripl, the White River Valley, Teplyak Shelter, the eastern alpine slope of Mount Guzeripl. The group followed this route exactly as planned and stopped at their designated campsite for the night. Then came the campfire, a celebratory first night dinner, a guitar, and, according to eyewitnesses, a significant amount of alcohol. The group drank heavily, performed theatrical sketches, and indulge in typical Soviet student entertainment. One of the witnesses, Boris Kolosov, recalled, "The day before the ascent to Fisht, they were celebrating someone's birthday. They had a great time, there was no discipline, and the instructors just let things slide. They had been drinking back at the Caucasus tourist base as well. People came to relax. They didn't really need an excuse to have a drink." Imagine this. Evening, night, the party doesn't die down, and many only fall asleep in the early morning. The next day, their condition was predictable. Severe hangovers, no appetite, nausea. Some even drank more alcohol in the morning to recover. Meanwhile, a steep uphill climb of several kilometers lay ahead. The partying had lasted almost until dawn, but their plan required them to start hiking with the first rays of the sun. Naturally, the guides couldn't get the group up at sunrise, and just feeding 50 people was already a major challenge. In the end, they lost 3 hours. 3 hours were crucial. Had they set off on time, the tragedy would never have happened. The weather that morning was already poor, but despite the worsening conditions, the guides decided to proceed with the route. After breakfast, the group set out toward the Fisht shelter. The trek was supposed to be extremely easy. Typically, hikers completed it in just an hour, but the group stretched out significantly. To put it mildly, they weren't feeling fresh after the previous night's gathering. On top of that, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. It grew cold and rain started to fall. The path gained elevation and the stones became slippery, further slowing down an already sluggish group. According to eyewitnesses, the air smelled of snow, and sure enough, before long, snow began to fall heavily. The temperature dropped sharply, and hurricane-force winds picked up. A full-blown storm had begun. These young people had come to the warm Caucasus during the velvet season, early September, when it was supposed to still be summer. They were completely unprepared for such extreme weather conditions. To make matters worse, the hikers had left the forest zone, which at least provided some shelter from the wind, and entered the alpine zone, where there was nowhere to hide. Statement to the investigator by instructor Alexei Safonov. "After about 8 kilometers of the 16 we had to cover that day, a hurricane-force wind suddenly hit after the rain. Ominous black clouds weren't just creeping in, they were flying straight at us. We found ourselves in an open, barren area with nowhere to take cover. I grew up in the mountains, hiked Elbrus with my father, but I had never seen anything like this in my life." Statement to the investigator by tourist Ludmila Kosyakova. "It all happened suddenly. A light drizzle didn't seem to signal an oncoming storm, not even when it turned into wet snow. Then, out of nowhere, the wind became so strong that it was impossible to stay on one's feet. Within minutes, it swept away one of our fellow hikers, Felix Shinov, like a feather. We saw him being carried away across the plateau at incredible speed before he vanished into the abyss. He didn't even have time to scream. Soon, the combination of wind, snow, and darkness made it impossible to see even 2 steps ahead. Panic set in. The hikers were scattered along the mountain slope. The fierce snowstorm reduced visibility to almost zero, but the guides kept pushing the group forward. Some people kept moving ahead. Others searched for shelter. Some, having exhausted all their strength, sat down to rest and froze to death. This is how Boris Kolosov recalled it years later. "We were stretched out in a long chain, moving along the eastern slopes of Mount Guzeripl." When the blizzard intensified and the trail disappeared from sight, the group came to a halt. Visibility was down to 2 to 3 meters at most. The wind drowned out the voices of the instructors, who were desperately trying to gather all 50 people together. Panic spread among the group. Despite spending time together, these people had never become a real team. They had only formed small friend groups of 3 to 5 people. And now, in these small groups, they tried to survive. In the end, the guides managed to bring together 2 groups. They began discussing what to do next. Incredibly, they even included inexperienced, panicked participants in the discussion. They stood in the middle of the trail, under hurricane-force winds, in a blizzard, with freezing people, debating whether to continue to the Fisht shelter, wait out the storm in the forest, or return to Teplyak. These doubts divided the group. It seems a conflict arose. One option was to leave the alpine zone and return to the forest, which they had left not long before. The forest was only 300 meters away. The second option was to push forward to Fisht. There was a forest zone there too, offering potential shelter. But to reach it, they had to cross a stream ominously named Graveyard Creek. The instructors argued for a long time, and during that time, some hikers split into groups and began doing whatever they thought best. Eventually, the guides decided to go back. But by then, the group had already fractured, and precious time had been lost. Some of these smaller groups included strong men with military backgrounds. They decided not to return with the guides, but to push forward 500 meters to the nearest forest. Among them were new leaders, apparently more authoritative than the student guides. A portion of the hikers followed these new leaders up the slope. Only 20 people stayed with the guides. They started making their way back to a shepherd's hut they had recently passed. In the blizzard, the hikers lost each other. The hurricane-force wind drowned out their voices. Their feet slipped on the snow. Thorny shrubs made it impossible to find a handhold. The goal seemed close when Seaman Dujansky fell into a ravine. Miraculously, he got caught on a tiny ledge. Behind him was a steep, almost polished rock face. Below him, a deep abyss. "Senya!" his friend Nikolai Zagoryansky shouted. "I'm coming!" "Don't, Kolya," Dujansky called back. "You'll send snow down on me and fall yourself." "When you're settled, throw me a rope." "All right, Senya!" Zagoryansky shouted back. "We'll make a fire and pull you out. Just hold on." "I'll hold on," came the reply from below. "Don't worry, I'll hold on." The descent took an hour and a half. Eventually, this part of the group reached the shepherd's hut, where the shepherds came to their aid. One of the instructors, Olga Kovaleva, went blind due to the icy snowstorm. The second instructor, Alexei, went out searching for the missing members. However, he managed to find only 3 people. The shepherds inside the hut had only one pair of boots between them, but they also set out in search and managed to bring back a few more people. A shepherd, Vitaly Ostretsov, brought 2 girls to the hut and pleaded with the men who had taken shelter there to help him pull another unconscious girl out of a deep ravine. However, not a single man responded to his request. Exhausted but determined, the shepherd continued searching and found 2 more hikers under a fir tree, who had no strength left to go on. He then returned to the hut and practically forced 2 strong men outside, telling them, "Bring the freezing people to the hut." But the men only walked a few meters away, waited for a while, then returned, regretfully claiming that they had found no one under the fir tree. The shepherd continued searching and eventually came across another splintered-off group of hikers. Here is how they remember what happened. They were desperate to get to warmth. Frost-bitten and exhausted, some had fallen behind. Ostretsov tried to hold the group back, urging them to help those who were left behind, but no one listened. They were rushing forward. "Guys, don't leave me!" Dina Nema, completely drained of energy, barely whispered. She could no longer move. Foam was coming from her mouth. "For the sake of my children, I have 2 of them!" Nearby were engineer Mikhail Reshkin, mechanic Valery Sokolov, and Vladimir Tretyakov, a teacher at a vocational school. Tretyakov reassured her, "Dina, don't be afraid. We won't leave you. Just rest a little. We'll be back soon." But they rushed ahead and never returned. After reaching the hut, they crawled under a blanket and soon fell asleep. Besides Zina, 3 others died on the way to the hut. "If we had helped everyone, there would have been more corpses," Sokolov would later state during the investigation. Instructor Alexei Safonov still hoped to gather the group and set out on a search with several strong men. They crossed the Mogilny stream and lit a fire beyond it. The instructor ordered them to keep the fire burning and continued searching. However, none of the young men already warming themselves by the fire wanted to help him. And what happened to the strong men who were the first to break away from the group, leading others with them? "Faster! To the life-saving forest! There's a fire! There's warmth!" they shouted, running ahead while abandoning their weakened companions. The raging wind helped them, drowning out voices, striking sharply against their backs, pushing people into the deep ravine of the Mogilny Valley. Yet the leaders who split the group still managed to reach the forest zone and light a fire. Whoever had the strength to reach the fire survived. The rest exhausted and disoriented in the blizzard, scattered across the steep slopes of the Mogilny River. The strong men who sat by the warm fire could hear the desperate cries for help from the dying all around them. Thus, the tourists who strayed from the path and followed the leaders were left abandoned on the mountainside, alone against the merciless elements. Rumors later spread that they not only refused to help anyone, but even stole warm clothing from those who were freezing to death. In the end, they accumulated a large supply of warm clothes, medicine, food, and spent the night relatively comfortably by the fire. On the morning of September 11, they had breakfast and, as if nothing had happened, set off for the tourist base. But don't get the impression that the entire group of 50 people consisted only of villains. While Alex Taraselsky was pushing the weak away from the barely smoldering fire, Vitaly Galushka from Zaporizhzhia, with frostbitten hands, was chopping branches for that very fire and, freezing to the bone, gave his sleeping bag to the exhausted girls. When Reshkin, Sokolov, and Tretyakov abandoned Zina, it was the worker Valery Nikitenkov who carried her and another tourist, Zoya, on his back. Eventually, he ran out of strength, and 17-year-old cook Igor Kolyada from Dnepropetrovsk took his place. He stayed with them until the very last moment. By the way, do you remember the two tourists under the fir tree? Here's what happened to them. They were Svetlana Vetrikush and Mikhail Osipenko. Svetlana was convinced that she would be rescued, that someone would come for her, that she was not forgotten. She fought alone against the elements for 3 days and survived. She survived on hope and faith that someone would reach her. Soaking wet, without warm clothes, matches, fire, or food, she built a shelter from branches and ferns under the massive fir tree. Around the tree, she cleared a path in the deep snow and kept moving constantly, not allowing herself to freeze. Only on September 13th, when she saw the rescue helicopter, did she leave her shelter and, silently crying, begin climbing the rocky slope toward the rescuers. She was the only one they found alive. Another interesting fact, the group we are talking about today, group number 93, was later encountered by the next group following them, group number 94. They met them at the Balagan, where part of the distressed tourists had already gathered. But Group No, 94, simply turned around and returned to the tourist base. They had enough strength and apparently the right equipment to do so. However, when they returned to the base, they did not even inform the rescuers that there was a group of tourists in distress at the top of the mountain. A very strange decision. The rescue operation itself is a separate story. First of all, it started very late. No one initially reported that tourists had gone missing in the mountains. Second, when they finally began searching, for some reason, they looked in a completely different area. Third, some of the survivors waited more than 3 days for rescuers, like the girl who waited under the fir tree and ended up with severe frostbite on her feet. Many simply did not live to see their rescue and froze to death. Then came the horrifying discoveries, as one rescuer recalled. "What did you find? A guy lying there with a guitar, wearing a light shirt, smiling. The others were the same, wearing light clothing. When they examined the backpacks, they found that each person had warm socks, sweaters, plenty of food, and enough firewood to build a huge bonfire. They never officially stated the reason for their deaths, but nearly all the tourists had been drinking. They had tried to keep warm with vodka. In the end, 21 people from the group died. Many others were injured and suffered severe frostbite. This tragedy was barely covered in the Soviet press. Only a few small articles in newspapers mentioned it. Then came the trial. The directors of the tourist bases were sentenced to a few years in prison. They even considered sentencing the meteorologist for failing to predict the terrible storm. But it turned out that he didn't have the proper equipment. He simply couldn't have predicted it. As for the guides, Alexei and Olga, they were involved in the case only as witnesses. Since they were not official guides, they didn't have certifications. In general, they weren't even supposed to lead this group. As a result, they bore no criminal responsibility, and those who pushed the freezing people away from the fire were never prosecuted. The court ruled that they had acted under extreme stress. Here, by the way, are some of the testimonies given in court by these so-called leaders. The descent to the bottom of the ravine took almost an hour and a half and was very difficult. Several times I had to stop to rest and take in the view. The snow on the trees, bushes, and grass created a very beautiful landscape. This is a statement given by Zotov to the investigator. Just now, the hurricane blew away Shinov. Duzhansky fell into the abyss. Through the roar of the storm, the screams of freezing people calling for help could be heard. When asked what he noticed in that moment, he answered, "The beautiful scenery. The greenery looks stunning." Such is the tragic story of ordinary people who treated the mountains with carelessness, ignored the dangers of the weather, and approached their responsibilities with negligence, ultimately revealing their true nature. Draw your own conclusions.